thank you for coming. Carla asked me to, and then I asked you again earlier, what you thought people would be interested in. And of course we already discussed this, so I prepared myself, but I wanted to hear it again, and I think the way you phrased it was useful for me. It's to get some idea, because you know that you've read that I've been working in the context of a collaboration between a choreographer and cognitive scientists. Carla said it would be interesting to know how that goes together. Why is that productive for us? So that, I think, is what I did prepare, fortunately, and is the story I'd like to try to tell you, to see, in a way, if it makes sense to you. If I can persuade you that this is a productive relationship on the basis of what I've understood over the last, in my experiences over the last, through my experiences over the last 10 years or so. My background isn't in science. My background's in dance. So, 80s, and in the 90s, a little bit early 90s, I was training a little bit of ballet, more contemporary, and then some improvisation work. And I was performing and making my own choreography because I was very interested in the creative process. And then I also performed for some small companies. So, and that was in the 80s, and in the 90s, I moved to the United Kingdom, and I worked for a place called the Centre for Performance Research in Wales. And there, in that context, I realized that I could, yes, I was interested in making art, but I realized I was interested in how art gets made, as much as I was interested in making it myself. And I had already, in the 80s, developed some labs with colleagues in collaborative situations where we explored and shared each other's process. So I shifted out of making art myself, and I no longer called myself an artist. And I shifted more into a research relationship with choreographers. And I was lucky enough, and now I'll move a little bit to the story with Wayne, because he's the person I'm here to talk about most of today. I was lucky enough to, at the end of the 90s, I met Wayne at a conference where he explained how he was working with a piece of software and young male dancers. And I thought the way he described it was very convincing, how he was working with this piece of software. And I also gave a talk there, and we began to share some ideas after this conference. And that was the first time we established a mutual interest in the creative process. But as I said, from him, it was as a choreographer, so he wanted to understand his own process better. He was curious about how he could improve his collaborations with people. And I was just interested in how people make things and how dances get made anyway. So that was our meeting point. And I suppose it's probably, yeah, I'll blow these up. So I've got a series of slides to help draw your attention to certain, I think, features of this collaboration in terms of its content. And I hope some of this material will give you an insight into what I think, where I think the productive relationship is between the cognitive science and the choreography. But I'll continue with a sort of story background, a bit of history. So the first, as I said, Wayne was interested in his own process, and I was interested more generally in how people make things. And Wayne was particularly interested. He had a kind of vision, and he was somebody. If you know his work at all, you may not know his work, but he was associated with new media. So he had an interest in new media technologies. He worked a lot with projections on stage. As I said earlier, he was working with a piece of software with young makers, performers. And he told me once, he said, wouldn't it be, he was very interested in whether or not it would be possible to create an artificially intelligent choreographic agent. So something that would be programmed in software that would solve dance-making problems in the studio alongside his dancers. And he was specifically thinking about artificial intelligence in the computer, kind of in the computer sense, because he'd read some things, and I was interested in his ideas, but I said, well, then how would we break that down? You know, how would we make such a thing? And if in the old school of artificial intelligence, you might say, well, you know, if we can build something that can simulate your own creative process, you know, if we can artificially build something like your brain, we'll understand the brain better. This was something old school artificial intelligence believed. If you read back to in the 50s and 60s, people writing about the computer, they thought, and this is also the early beginnings of cognitive science, a history in which I'm not expert, but the early beginnings of cognitive science, they were very interested in how computers could simulate maybe brain, you know, processes, thinking processes. And so they tried modeling in the computer these processes. So Wayne, you know, Wayne had picked up some of this, and I picked up some of this, and we decided that if we were going to build something that was artificially intelligent, we should understand the nature of the intelligence as it was experienced in his own process. So in other words, before we could make it, we had to understand it better. And that's what inspired us to organize meetings. Initially, they were just conversations with people in cognitive science. They turned out to be cognitive psychologists, to be specific about their field. Cognitive science is a general kind of term that catches a lot of different disciplines. For those of you who have worked a little bit in that field, with Carla, with linguistics, you realize cognitive science can include anthropology, linguistics, computation, you know, artificial intelligence, neuroscience. So cognitive science, anyway, is sort of inherently interdisciplinary. So it makes it an interesting field, because I think that one of the motivations in order to solve some of the complicated problems having to do with intelligence or thinking or the brain, they felt that we need all of these different disciplines. But again, that's a history that I already said I'm not so familiar with. So we organized a series of conversations with scientists who we knew were already interested in art. So we knew through other connections, you know, just to give you some of their history, just, you know, practically speaking, we knew through other connections they were interested in art and perception, attention, you know, the various kinds of things that they felt that art would challenge them to try to understand, art making. And through that process of 8 or 9 conversations, I think in the third conversation, we had 1 or 2 conversations which didn't go very well. And I don't know whether that was because of us or the scientists. It just seemed not productive. You know, we sat down and yes, it was interesting, but I couldn't see how we could continue to work on the question our question of creativity and understanding it better through their lens, through the lens of the scientists, because that's what we thought we might benefit from, was their understanding of thought and thinking in the mind and our curiosity about creativity. But the first 2 meetings were not very productive. Hi, Stefan. The third meeting, before we went into the meeting, and now I'm going to introduce a principle which I think you'll catch running throughout this talk. The third meeting, I said, Wayne, you know, we've been generally describing your work. I think we'd even shown some videos of finished work to the scientists we met with. But why don't we focus on something you do in the creative process? Why don't we focus on when you work with your dancers to generate movement material? So at the very early stage of the process, so you come into the studio, and Wayne works with, he gives the dancers instructions, what he calls tasks. Maybe they're like games, improvisation, scores that the dancers work with to create movement material. And then Wayne, with the dancers, sort of selects some of that material, so some gets edited out, and begins to gather the material together that he will use to structure the piece. So this is important for you who aren't familiar with dance-making processes. I think a lot of you are, but some of them. Is that at the very early stage, it's not unusual for a choreographer and his company to start just generating material. You don't know what it's going to be at the end, but you got to just have stuff to start working with. So I said, why don't you describe one of your exercises? And one of the exercises was he would ask his dancers, he would ask one dancer to improvise, just improvise in the space. The other dancers would watch, and they would draw features of that movement in the space, kind of like notating it, except they weren't specialists. They would just be asked to draw the things you notice, but draw separate make little separate drawings. Don't just draw one continuous line. Make a little drawing, then make another little drawing, make another little drawing. So you had little hieroglyphs in a way. Now, then he asked the dancers to select one of those little drawings. So they're just marks, like that, and then another little sketch here, another little sketch here. No, what you might think of as thought involved, just reacting, just feeling what's coming in the drawing. Then he asked them to select one they liked and extrude it. So draw it out of the page into a three-dimensional object. So right off the page, out into a three-dimensional object. And then work with that three-dimensional object to create movement material. So let's say you draw something like that, you pull it out of the page, and you could place that three-dimensional object inside you. So it could be inside your body, or it could be outside your body, or it could be something on that side of the space, or you move into it. So that's what he described in the next meeting. And in the next meeting, we were with about 4 different cognitive psychologists who were interested. And that really seemed to get them. Well, it didn't seem to. It did immediately interest them, because they said, how is that happening? How is it that the dancers are, it was a small focused moment, but it immediately inspired them to have a conversation amongst themselves about how the dancers were doing that in terms of their thinking process. How were they imaging that? And how were they responding to Wayne's instructions? It was a very productive exercise to describe to them. And that's what started the whole thing, in a sense. That's when we realized that the creative process itself, so rather than looking at the finished work and trying to understand that from a cognitive psychologist perspective, but just thinking about moments of making, and break those down and examine them and articulate and bring articulation to them, bring language to them. And this is what we wanted, and I can give you already, I can tell you what's been a benefit to us, is that they've brought language to that experience. We have more language for describing that experience than we did when we started. And that in and of itself has been inherently valuable for us. We have structured ways of thinking about it, structured ways of describing it. I'll get to those. I'll get to that a little later when we get to the model. So this is a project we did. We organized, the next thing we did is building on that productive conversation, we asked 4 of them to join us for a research period of 6 months. And we were lucky enough to get some funding, joint collaborative funding from the Arts Council and the higher education funding. And we invited them into the studio. So this is a snap, obviously this is Wayne, very dark, but he's up there in the back. So the scientists came into the studio to watch Wayne creating movement material with the dancers. So they had the opportunity to experience what had only been described to them. And Wayne worked on exercises in the morning, and then in the afternoon we met in more of a conference room setting like this, and I literally just asked the scientists what they thought they saw from their own perspective as cognitive psychologists, to describe to us what they thought they saw happening. And that's when we also realized, without having planned it, that if it had been only one scientist, this person would have only had us to describe it using his language, only us to talk to. So with 4 or 5, they pretty much began to debate amongst themselves, using their own terminology and using the background of shared understanding they had, what it is they saw. And that was also very productive. So it was very good to have more than one.